Anyway, I'm Van, and I love Mass Effect. Mass Effect is easily one of my favorite games of all time, or at least one of my favorite game trilogies, because I don't really consider it complete if you only play the first one, and I definitely don't consider it complete if you play the fourth one. But I replayed it recently, as in, like, a couple of months ago, and it struck me by just how science fiction it isn't. Now, what I mean by this is not that it doesn't take place in a science fiction setting, because of course it does. I mean, obviously, there's spaceships and existential cosmic horror. Alien sex. It's all here. All the hallmarks of a good science fiction story. They're here. Mass Effect doesn't hit the same story tropes or the same story notes that most other science fiction does. The general tone of a science fiction anything is pretty identifiable. It's typically relatively grounded, relatively engrossed in this idea that this could be our future, or at least a future. And yeah, Mass Effect does a little bit, it does a smidge, but Earth and the way that history diverged to create Mass Effect's universe are pure fantasy already. It's such pure fantasy that I almost thought it was Bloodborne 2. So then, what classifies it as a high fantasy story? From sci-fi to high fantasy, we have science fiction. Then we have science fantasy. Then we have fantasy science, where science is used as a backdrop, but it's written by somebody who didn't care enough to do all of the research. Then you get to low fantasy, where you have certain small fantastical elements, but nothing huge or overwhelming. Game of Thrones started very low fantasy, and the only really magical thing that was identifiable were certain things like being immune to fire. Then you have high fantasy, which is what most people consider traditional fantasy. This is populated by things like Dragon Age Origins, Lord of the Rings, Mass Effect. I'll get there, don't worry, I'm meandering a bit, I apologize. Lastly, there's dark fantasy. And dark fantasy I consider the final evolution of fantasy, and this doesn't make it any better or any worse. It's just as far as we've gotten. I'll go into depth on all of these at some point in a different video, but this video is about Mass Effect, so let's go back to that. There are 5 things that make a high fantasy story a high fantasy story. Mass Effect has all 5 of these things. They're in no particular order, no particular level of importance, minus I think the last one, which I'll talk about because it is more of a guideline. I wrote them down on my clipboard. So, my number 1 criteria for something being high fantasy: it takes place on another world. This doesn't mean it takes place on another planet. This means that it takes place on another piece of existence that is separate from Earth and our reality. Earth may exist in this story, but Earth is not the primary setting. Earth is not the primary backdrop. In Mass Effect, we don't even really, see Earth until the 3rd game. Of course, we can visit near Earth, we can land on the moon, we can be like, hey, what's up, how you doing? I see continents over there, I know them. You can't land on it. And once you're in Mass Effect 3, the game where you do actually land on Earth, it is only at the beginning of the game and the end of the game. It is a set piece. It is not a setting. The setting is everything else. All of those other planets are other worlds by definition. The first mission in all of Mass Effect was on a pretty Earth-like planet, don't get me wrong, but Eden Prime is not Earth. Middle-earth, still not Earth. Faerun, still not Earth. But that's only the first qualifier. A lot of science fiction stories do the same thing. Again, Warhammer 40k, even though there is a pretty strong amount of Earth content, mostly takes place off of Earth as well. Criteria number 2. There is a clear good versus evil story happening, as well as a hierarchy of villains that allow you to progress. Really, this is more of a story trope than anything, but it's a pretty omnipresent one, you know? It's so much easier to write a story if the focus of the story is good versus evil, because everyone knows what that story entails. It means that the good guys win and the bad guys lose, even if, especially in modern times, the good guys suffer losses. In Mass Effect, there is a clear hierarchy of villains. With the first game, you have Charon, who in turn also has Sovereign, who has Harbinger, who is the big bad controlling everything from behind the scenes. It exists more as, again, that existential cosmic threat, more than one that is a direct in-your-face threat. But that's, again, usually seen in fantasy stories as well. You see it in Aragon, you see it in Lord of the Rings. Again, I keep using Lord of the Rings, but it is the blueprint for fantasy. I'll try to move away from it if I can think of better examples. And of course, this doesn't mean that the characters are always going to be 100% good. A lot of the time, they're not. There are renegade options as well. But of course, the canon Shepherd is typically going to be the Paragon Shepherd. There may be certain renegade actions that Shepherd has taken, but people like having a hero. 3. For any good high fantasy story, there needs to be a well-defined magic system. That's probably a bit of a controversial take, because of course you can have a fantasy story, a world where there are fantasy creatures and fantasy things, but they exist in a setting that is devoid of magic. Going to work and hanging out with your grung coworker and chatting about banking business all day. Like, that's the kind of thing that this would be. But Mass Effect has a well-defined magic system, and that magic system is biotics. Biotics are explained with science, but magic is typically going to be the manipulation of a thing or presence that can't be done or even felt sometimes by people who aren't in the know. Biotics control dark matter, that thing that is always around us at all times, that we think comprises the majority of the universe, that we cannot see, touch, or interact with, in theory. But what this means is that it is essentially magic just science-ified. In the same vein, you have things like antimatter and shit like that people always use as the science fiction equivalent of magic. But biotics really go into the nitty-gritty, and they explain how it all works. There are schools that educate individuals on how to use and manipulate their biotic abilities. Tell me that's not just a guild of wizards training their little wizard apprentices to do wizard shit. You cannot tell me I'm wrong. I'm 100% correct. Number 4. Multiple non-human races. Specifically, multiple non-human races that already have histories with each other outside of humanity. And typically, but not always, humanity will be the newcomer here, and they will be the ones that are just like left out of all of the stuff, and humans are going to be indignant about it. It's a lot of very specific things that I just said, but humans are almost always seen as butting into these other things and taking over rapidly. We want to be felt and seen as conquerors in our story, so we intrinsically write stories with that in mind. But again, in Mass Effect, we have Asari, Krogan, Turian, Salarian, Borcha, Hanar, Volus. I could keep going, too. That's the insane thing. We have Yogg. We have so many different alien races in Mass Effect that all have clearly different lifespans, clearly different biologies, and clearly they have drawn inspiration from other things in fantasy. Asari are clearly elves. On to number 5. And this is the one that I think is the least necessary to define a high fantasy story, but it is, again, often very present within these stories. The main character cannot be the main character before the story starts. They can be notable, they can be competent, but they can't be the main character until fate has pushed them to it. You are not the chosen one until you are chosen. In the case of Commander Shepard, a notable war hero basically no matter which background you choose for them. However, they were not the commander of their own ship, they were a captain beneath a commander. They gained almost everything that they have over the course of Mass Effect's story. To cap it all off, Shepard dies a hero and a martyr for the entirety of the galaxy, essentially cementing Shepard's place as a god, as a Talos of the Mass Effect universe. The Chosen One and the hero's journey are very, very present in Mass Effect. Now, how did this happen? How did Mass Effect, a game that is so definitely and obviously supposed to be a science fiction story, how did it become a fantasy story? Well, it's really easy to figure out when you actually think about it, and that's because BioWare made it. BioWare had so much experience in making a fantasy story that they actually really knocked it out of the park with almost every CRPG that they made before this. They had some bummers, some bad ones. Of course they did. They were busy. They were making things. Baldur's Gate, for instance. The original Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 were both made by BioWare. And Baldur's Gate 2 is still considered one of the best CRPGs and RPGs of all time. BioWare also worked on Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic. What's up, kid? Longest? Okay, how far was the snipe? 313 meters? That's crazy, dude. Do you, what's your longest no-scope? Is it still 200 and whatever? 210. Okay, well now you gotta get a longer no-scope. Now you gotta get a longer no-scope. I'm sorry, what was I saying? BioWare made fantasy games and pulled inspiration from those fantasy games in order to make Mass Effect, because that was what they had experience in. They wanted to do something different in a different setting with different characters, and they wanted to flex their creative muscles. And it just so happened to work out tremendously in their favor. Maybe I'm biased, because I do love a good fantasy story, and have always gravitated towards fantasy stories over science fiction stories. Maybe I'm flat out wrong. Maybe I'm rambling like a crazy person, and this video is going to have an insanely high dislike ratio. Not that you can see the dislikes anymore anyway, but people still do leave dislikes, so. It's also possible that I'm just arbitrarily splitting hairs and creating criteria in order to justify me saying head-ass shit at a camera, but you know what? At least I believe in the head-ass shit that I'm saying. Not like our politicians. Thank you guys so much for watching this silly little video. I just was sitting at work bored as hell in my office one day, and it came to me like a flash of lightning what I wanted to write about. Really, if I'm being even pickier about the genre and subgenre that Mass Effect would fit into, it would be a high fantasy space opera, which of course just sounds like sci-fi with extra steps. But it is different, intrinsically, if you really get into the, like, nitty-gritty of it. It's like if you were to go up to a metalhead and you were to ask them if they were listening to nu metal, but they were listening to, like, Broken Side or something. I'm in a weird headspace tonight. Got an eviction notice from my landlord earlier. Don't know why I'm telling you, but I want to own my house, man. That'd be great. Fuck the economy. Fuck billionaires. Eat the rich. Anyway, y'all have a great rest of your night.